Okay, now so far we saw the meaning of the poem. Now we are going to discuss about the themes, the symbolism in the poem and the figure of speech that are used in the poem. Okay, now when we talk about the theme, I told you when I explained the fourth stanza, I told you this is a very important stanza because it gives us layers and layers of meaning. Now I told you the very first line, it tells us about the attractive nature of woods. Okay, so now these woods, though they are attractive, the author knows very well, or the poet knows very well, or the speaker knows very well that he should not stop himself here and just keep admiring the nature and forget his responsibilities and duties. But what he has to do? He has to leave this place and he has to continue his day's journey because he has lot of work left in his village as well as in his working place to be completed. Okay, so from this stanza or from the entire poem, Robert Frost is trying to tell us the message that in everyone's life there will be some responsibilities, or there will be some purposes, or there will be some duties. So the important thing we have to do is we have to accomplish all our duties sincerely. Okay, in life, every stage of life has its own temptations, has its own attractions. For example, when you were a small child, okay, the biggest or the challenging thing for all of us was to sit and study, sit and do our homeworks. What was very tempting for us at that age? Playing, going out, not doing our homeworks, not sitting and studying. That was the temptation, or that was the attraction which prevented us from sitting and studying or sitting and doing our homeworks. Okay. As you grow up, maybe as you go to your college level or when you start working, okay, you may have friends who are well settled, but when compared to your friends or when compared to some people, you will be forced to do a lot of work. By seeing them, you may be forced to give up, and by seeing them, you may be forced to join with them, leaving your duties and responsibilities. So like that, in every stage of our life, okay, sometimes someone who is a very good player, someone who is a very good dancer, someone who is very good in singing, if these are their talents, they have to pursue that. They should not be worried about others. Worrying about others is their temptation, is their attraction, stopping them from doing their duty. So, in every stage of our life, whether we are a small child or a grown up or an elderly person, every stage of life offer its own attractions, offer its own temptations, preventing us from doing our duty. But Robert Frost through this poem is telling us that every one of us must concentrate in accomplishing our duties of our life, whether it is the duty for the day or for the entire life. That is one of the themes. Now other themes, some of the critics, they say that just because Robert Frost is a nature poet, nature can always be, see, in one way he is discussing that we should not be completely lost in nature, forgetting our duties, but when it will not be harmful unless and until you know the limit. You can take nature as a solace. What is solace? Solace is to take rest, relax. As far as you take nature just for relaxation, just for solace, just for one diversion, it is not a problem. But when you cross that limit, forgetting your own reality, forgetting your duties, then only it becomes a problem. So these are the two major themes that are discussed in the poem. You can always rely nature, you can always trust nature. Nature is the best companion, nature is a best friend. It gives us all sorts of comforts for us, but that comfort will be of good unless and until we maintain that limit. Forgetting ourselves, if we start to linger for long and long in nature, it is going to be of no use. So we should also consider nature for us to relax. At the same time, we should also not forget our duties. We should aim in accomplishing our duties. These are the two important themes that are dealt with in the poem. Okay, now coming to symbolism. Symbolism is a technique actually. What is meant by symbolism is, I told you symbolism is a technique. So now what is meant by this technique called symbolism? Usually in symbolism, some things are used to denote something else. For example, some objects. For example, some objects are used. Now if you see in this poem, you have so many objects. Now what are the objects that are listed in this poem? You have woods, you have horse, okay, and of course you have that house mentioned, no? His house is in the village though. Okay, then of course you have frozen lake. Like that, so many things we come across in the poems of Robert Frost. Not only this poem, almost in most of his poems, Robert Frost is well known for using symbolism. He always uses this technique of symbolism by the usage of objects or things in order to denote some deeper meanings, deeper philosophical themes and social themes of life. Okay, so now in this poem, these are some of the things the poet has used. Now, what do these woods signify? I told you the meaning of the word woods. I told you the meaning is forest. Grown up trees, densely grown trees, we call it as woods. But what do they symbolize? What do they imply? Okay, these woods, I told you, no, when I was talking about the themes, I told you, no, in every stage of life we have lot of attractions and temptations to prevent us from doing our duties. So these woods in the poem, they symbolize all the attractions. You can use any word, attractions, temptations. Okay, these woods denote all the attractions and temptations in everyone's life. Okay, because always attractions, temptations are always will be very attractive for us. No? When your parents says not to eat chocolate because it is not good for health, we'll be immediately tempted towards chocolate because chocolate in front of us, it appears to be very tempting, very attractive, very appetizing. Okay, so these woods that comes in the poem, they denote to all that are attractive and tempting in everyone's life. Okay, now this horse. Now what does this horse do? In the third stanza we saw that he gives his harness bells a shake. Now before the third stanza we saw that the traveler, he has stopped in the middle of the forest and he has forgotten himself, forgotten his reality. Why he has forgotten his reality? He just admired, he started admiring the beauty of woods. Okay, the attractive nature of woods, the lovely nature of woods, and he had completely forgotten himself. So he is in a state of trance now. He has completely forgotten the reality. So in that state, in order to bring back the master, that is the horse's master, back to reality, what is the horse doing? The horse is shaking his harness bells. So now, by shaking his harness bells, the horse is trying to bring back his master to reality. So now what do these horse stand for here or symbolize here? Are like inner conscience, we can say. Or if you are a small child, usually who will be always reminding you about your duties? Your parents. Okay, so any common sense. It can be your internal common sense or your external common sense means I mean the society. Society, it can be anyone, your parents, your friends, your well-wishers or anybody for that matter. So any common sense that reminds you of your reality, that reminds you of your duties, responsibilities are denoted in this poem by the thing or the symbol horse. The horse is shaking his harness bells to bring back the poet or the master to reality. In the same way, in our life, we have people or we have something or the other in our life to always remind us about our duties and responsibilities and to bring back to our reality. Okay, now this house and along with this house, I can also add that village. If you remember, we saw these two words in the very first stanza. His house is in the village though. Whose house is in the village though? The owner of the woods, his house is in the village. Okay, so now this village and house, they are not there somewhere in the forest or somewhere in the middle of the forest or nearby the forest. It is far away from the forest. Both the village and the house, they are far away from the forest. Now forest here, it stands for uncivilized things, uncivilized society. So contrary to this forest, this village and house stands for civilization. Okay, so this forest stands for uncivilized aspects of life. Contrary to this forest, this village and house which are far away from the forest, they denote civilization. Okay, finally this frozen lake. I think we came across this word in the second stanza of the poem, between the woods and frozen lake. Okay, I told you woods are attractions. Okay, so woods, so in between the woods and frozen lakes means woods are on one side, frozen lake is on the other side. So of course it is understood that both are contrary to each other. Okay, both are not same. Okay, so now woods stands for something unfamiliar. Fear of the unknown, that is a very popular phrase, no? So something which is always unfamiliar, we will always tempted to try that unfamiliar things, unknown things. So all those unfamiliar things are represented by wood. Whereas this frozen lake, it refers to our familiar lifestyle. So now the traveler is caught between the woods and the frozen lake, that is familiar life and unfamiliar life, his routine life and a new life, new challenging life. Okay, so now the choice is his, whether he has to decide he is going to take up the familiar life or the new adventurous life. It depends upon each one of us in our lives. Okay, so these are some of the symbols that are used in the poem. I will repeat again. Symbolism means many of the authors or many of the poets, they use some objects or things in their work to denote some broader social themes or philosophical themes. And Robert Frost, he is well known for the usage of symbolism in most of his poetry. Okay, and this Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, right from the title, the poet has been employing so many symbols, and some of the symbols are woods. I told you the meaning of woods here is forest, but the woods that are mentioned in the poem, they symbolize attractions in life or temptations in life. And one more symbolism is they talk about or they represent all the unfamiliar aspects of life. Second symbolism that is used is the horse. The horse, by shaking his harness bells, it's trying to bring back the poet or his master to reality. So this horse denotes all the common sense that is related. Common sense means not only, I am not only talking about the abstract quality. Common sense means it may even refer to people. It can be your own common sense or the common sense of someone else. But generally common sense always reminding us of our duties and responsibilities and trying to bring back us to reality. And the third one is the village and the house. Okay, village and the house which is very far away from the forest, they denote civilization, whereas the forest denote uncivilized life. Okay, and finally we have the frozen lake. As I told you, woods represent the unfamiliar life. This frozen lake represents the familiar life. Okay, so now with that I think I have explained symbolism that is used in the poetry. So now next thing and the last thing we will talk about is the figures of speech that are used in the poetry in this poem. Okay. Okay. Now if you take the entire poem as a whole itself, the poem itself is a metaphor. Of course, metaphor, symbolism, all more or less they are same. Now metaphor, how does the entire poem become as metaphor? This is a journey. In the poem we see that a traveler is traveling, he is traveling among the woods, but he is also having another choice. Like, what is the other choice? He can get back to his village and continue his daily work or routine work. So now with these three things we can, the journey, the journey that is taken by the traveler, we can relate it to what? To the life journey. Okay. Then the traveler is each one of us. The woods, as I told you when I was explaining about symbolism, they stand for all the attractions of life. Clear? And finally, the village or the house or the duties that are waiting for us, sorry, the village and house, they denote the duties that each one of us have to accomplish in our lives. So in that way, the entire poem can be treated as a metaphor. Apart from that, we have personification. Now what is meant by personification? Personification is giving human quality or attributing human quality to non-human things. So when we say about non-human things, it is inclusive of both objects and animals. Clear? So personification is just like making an object or an animal either to talk or behave like human beings. When that is done, we say personification is implied or used in that particular piece of work. Now if you see in this poem, I think it is second stanza, very first line. My little horse must think it cure. Hope you all remember. My little horse must think. Okay, the rest of the lines I just don't want to. Okay, now I told you what is personification. Attributing or giving human quality to non-human things. Non-human things can be either objects or animals. Now what is a non-human thing here? It is the little horse. Now what quality of human is given to this little horse? The quality of thinking. We are not sure whether the animals have these capacities of thinking or not. Okay, maybe in this contemporary age that may also be possible, but generally talking, animals don't have this capacity of thinking. But in this poem, the poet has given here like, my little horse must think. So what is the poet trying to tell? The horse is thinking. So by giving this quality of thinking to the horse, the poet has used personification in this poem. So when you are given this line and when they ask you to mention what is the figure of speech used in this line, you have to say it, that is personification is used in this line. Then another figure of speech that is used here is imagery. What is meant by imagery? Okay, using words in a poem in such a way that without any pictorial representation or without any image form or picture form, we ourselves, that is the readers themselves, are able to imagine how the setting would be or how the situation would be or how that incident would be. In such a way, if the words are used, in such a way if the words are employed, we can then say that imagery is used. I'll repeat, imagery is again a technique. In that technique, words of the poem is used in such a way that when we read the poem itself, those pictures, they just come in front of our eyes. We are able to imagine those situations and scenes and sequences. So it is a pictorial representation of the things that is happening in the poem by the usage of just only words. No pictures, no drawings, no images. Only through words they are making us to see what is happening. So that is what we call it as imagery. Now if you see in this poem, you have so many examples of imagery. If you see the first stanza, last line, to watch his woods fill up with snow. So when the poet is saying the woods are being filled up with snow or getting filled up with snow, we are able to imagine the fall of snow, snowfall all over the woods. So that is how these words help us to imagine, or these words help us, or they bring the picture in front of our eyes as we read them itself. In the same way, second stanza, last line, when they say the darkest evening of the year, again we are able to imagine how the evening would be. Not a very bright evening, okay, not a very warm evening, darkest evening of the year. As soon as we read these words, we are able to imagine how dark that evening would be, how quiet that evening would be. So all these things we are able to imagine just when we read the word, the darkest evening of the year. Then again, of easy wind and downy flake. Okay, so when you see these words of easy wind and downy flake, the previous line for this is the only other sounds, the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So when you read these two lines, we are able to imagine that how quiet that place is, how you are able to hear the sound of the wind and sound of the snowfall. So all these imaginations take place just with the help of these words. So these are some of the lines in the poem where imagery is employed or used. Then of course, as in all the poems, we have alliteration used. Of course, we have alliteration. What is alliteration? Alliteration is repetition of consonant sounds in the same line in the beginning of words. Very first line of the poem, we have alliteration used. Okay, whose woods? So if you see these two words, the first letter is repeated. This we call it as consonant sound. Okay, alliteration is repetition of consonant sound in the same line, in the beginning of the words of the same line. Okay, so the very first line of the poem, whose woods? So you have the consonant sound were repeated. Okay, so you can say this line is alliterated and the alliterated sound is were. Okay, then talking about the rhyme scheme of the poem. Beginning of my lesson itself, or beginning of my class itself, I told you the poem is structured with 4 stanzas, and all the 4 stanzas are uniformly structured. Clear? There is no difference at all because the same meter is followed. What do you mean by meter? Meter is how the line of a poetry is structured. We call it as meter. If some of you are musical students, you may know in music you follow some notes, basic notes. What do you mean by notes? Repeated basic patterns or rhythmic patterns that you follow in music, you call them as notes. Same way in poetry, if some basic rhythm is repeated, it is followed again and again, we call it as meter. Okay, now throughout this poem you have the same meter repeated or same meter used. All the 4 stanzas, they have only 4 lines, and every line they have 8 syllables. And these 8 syllables are the first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. So if you have this pattern of the first syllable stressed and the second syllable, first syllable unstressed and second syllable stressed, again repeated. unstressed, stressed. So if you have this pattern for all the 8 syllables, we call them as iamb. And just because it is 4 unstressed syllables and 4 stressed syllables, we call the meter as iambic tetrameter. So this is the foot of this poem. Okay, I'll repeat. You have alliteration used in this poem. Alliteration is nothing but repetition of consonant sounds in the beginning of in the beginning letter of words in the same line. In the first line of the poem itself, we have alliteration used. Whose, whose. In these 2 words, the consonant sound was repeated. So alliteration is used in this poem. Then when we talk about the rhyme scheme of the poem, we were discussing about the structure of the poem. The poem has 4 stanzas. All are uniformly structured stanzas with 4 lines, and they follow the same meter. What is meant by meter? I told you, the way every line is structured, a common some rhythmic pattern is followed, we call it as meter. Okay, now what about this poetry? How are the lines in this poem is structured? Every line in this poem, they have 8 syllables. Okay, now these 8 syllables, how they are coined or formed? They are unstressed and stressed. Alternative syllables are unstressed and alternative syllables are stressed. So first you have unstressed syllable followed by stressed, again unstressed, stressed. So like this you have 8 syllables. So totally you have 4 unstressed syllables and 4 stressed syllables. So when you have this alternative pattern of unstressed and stressed, you call them as iambic or iamb. Now just because you have 4 unstressed and 4 stressed, you call it as tetrameter. So the feet is iambic tetrameter. Now talking about the rhyme scheme, if you see the first stanza, the last words are no, though, third line last word is here, and fourth line last word is snow. So if you see this, no, though, snow, they all rhyme together. So you can name them as A and A. But if you see the third line last word, it has a different rhyming pattern. So we can name it as B. Now coming to the second stanza, all the last words. First line you have here, second line you have near, and third line you have lay, and the fourth line you have year. Now if you see, from the third line the pattern is followed. So now here, near, year all have the same rhyming pattern like the word here. So you can give the same same rhyme here. But again this third word is of different rhyming pattern. So we can go for the next numbering. Okay, now again talking about the same third stanza also follow the same. Okay, shake, mistake, sweep, flake, no? Flake. So now if you see, in this stanza, these 3 words are rhyming with the word from the third stanza, lake. So you can give them the same numbering. But we have one more thing, a different rhyme, that is sweep. So we have to name it differently. Now coming to the last stanza. Now all the words in the last stanza, that is the last words in the last stanza, they rhyme with the third stanza, third line, last word. So you can all give the same numbering. So if you see the rhyme scheme of this entire poem, okay, and this is, critics usually say this is a very difficult form to practice and follow to when you are writing about an imaginative piece of work. Okay, so this is the rhyme scheme of the entire poem. Now if they ask the rhyme scheme of the entire poem, you can write this, but if they just give you 4 lines and they ask you to write only the rhyme scheme of the 4 lines. According to the stanza that has been given to you, you can mention the rhyme scheme. Now I'm sure that you are clear how to number the rhyming words of the poem, and of course these words are called as rhyming words. If they give the first stanza and they ask you to write the rhyming words of the first stanza, you can write no, though and snow. Same way, second stanza, if they give you and ask you to write the rhyming words, you can write here, near and here. Okay. And third stanza, shake, mistake and flake. And of course last stanza, all the 4 last words, deep, keep and sleep, they are rhyming. So this is what is meant by rhyme scheme and rhyming words. So with this we have come to the end of this poem. The last figure of speech we have is repetition. Repetition of the very famous lines, and miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. Why poets or generally authors they use repetition is in order to emphasize something. What is meant by emphasizing? Emphasizing is giving importance to something, because the poet, maybe Robert Frost, felt that these are the very important lines of the poem, so he wanted to give more and more importance to those lines or this line by repeating it for the second time. Okay, so by repeating the same line for the second time, the poet has also used repetition in this poem. Okay, so now we have come to the end of the class. With this I have completed this poetry and hope the poem is very clear. The basic conflict, if you talk about the basic conflict or contrasting things, means you have so many contrasting things in this poem, but the basic conflict is between attraction and responsibility. So the poet always, Robert Frost, in all his poetry, he gives us a social message, philosophical message. In this poem, through this poem, he is trying to tell us that in every one of our lives we have attraction, but we have to overcome those attractions and temptations, and we should sincerely complete our duties and responsibilities before we go to bed for every day and for the entire life, that is for our eternal sleep. Thank you.